The outcome of the 2017 general election campaign was, in my view, as big a turning point as the 1979 general election, another campaign which had an historic outcome. There was, of course, a big difference. In 1979, there was a change of Prime Minister, and what a change. In 2017, there was no change of Prime Minister at the end of the campaign, and yet there was a sense that everything had changed. There was something Shakespearean in Theresa May's decision to call an early election. She didn't have to call one, of course, and she was adamant, genuinely so, that she had no intention of calling one in her early months as Prime Minister. But she succumbed in the end, and in doing so challenged the natural order of things. And this is where it gets Shakespearean. One of the great Shakespearean theories is that whenever a leader challenges the natural order of things, he or she unleashes forces that turn on the person who challenged the natural order. That in an attempt to achieve ambition or whatever, you end up destroying yourself. King Lear, Macbeth in his castle, killing the king in an attempt to get the crown, ends up destroying himself. Now, I don't think there will be a play at Stratford called Theresa May to follow King Lear and Macbeth, but there was this breaking of the natural order of things. There is something about a Prime Minister holding a general election for the normal mixture of motives, including personal ambition, that unleashes forces that destroy them. Ted Heath was the last Prime Minister to do it in February 1974. He didn't need to call one as early as that. He posed the question, who governs? And the voters said, not you. And he was out of power at the end of the election. Theresa May called an election when she didn't have to call one, unleashed forces that, while she's still in power, came close to destroying her. It is easy to forget how dominant she was before calling that election. Cabinet ministers were frightened of her and her team. Even in private, they were scared to criticise her, and indeed weren't inclined to do so because she was so dominant. She had won that leadership contest. She was way ahead in the opinion polls, always something that gives a Prime Minister authority. On the whole, the media was pretty appreciative, respectful, and in some cases more than that, about Theresa May and her leadership. And the voters seemed to be responding positively as well as she began to shape her new agenda. All that changed within seconds of the exit poll being broadcast at 10 o'clock on the night of the election, the exit poll forecasting a hung parliament. So what led her to take that decision, which was a change of mind, to call the early election? There were many, and they were all powerful, even if retrospectively she's made a fatal mistake. They included the obvious one. When polls suggest you're close to walking on water and you have a legitimate reason for calling an election in that you personally was never elected as a Prime Minister, it's not bad ammunition. There you are reading opinion polls and a host of commentators saying if there were to be an election, Jeremy Corbyn and his Labour Party would be slaughtered. Theresa May would win a huge majority. Remember, she was struggling with a tiny majority inherited from David Cameron. And that was the second reason, one that is easily overlooked, why she was tempted to call an election. Although on the whole things have gone pretty smoothly for Theresa May since she became Prime Minister, before she called the election anyway, one thing had gone badly wrong. The budget, which she had worked on with the Chancellor Philip Hammond, contained a tax rise that it became very clear could never be implemented because it had been ruled out in the Cameron-Osborne manifesto on which they were all elected in 2015. And she was defining herself partly as being the non-Cameron-Osborne Prime Minister. She sacked George Osborne as Chancellor, and the Cameroons went the same way. She was trying to carve a new agenda whilst working to the 2015 manifesto that on the whole she had viewed with a degree of disdain. So it was sorely tempting, and in the end, actually tempting, to call an election and get your own personal mandate. The third reason, again, was pretty compelling and obvious: Brexit. Brexit is in every calculation of a Prime Minister post the referendum. And David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, was a strong advocate of calling an election for them to get their own mandate. They were worried that the 2015 Parliament would play games and make it very difficult in relation to Brexit. They were also acutely conscious that they would be having to call an election in 2020, if she didn't call one earlier, soon after Brexit. Whereas if they called one in 2017, won a huge majority, it wouldn't be until 2022 when they would go again. So unsurprisingly, she succumbed during a walking holiday in Wales. And I think it is true that's when she made the final decision. But I can tell you her colleagues and senior advisors were planning for it in case she came to that conclusion. The announcement itself, it was the last great moment of unambiguous glory that Theresa May experienced in the months that were to follow, was brilliantly executed. No one leaked it. The Sunday papers, it was over the Easter weekend, ache for speculative news stories. There were none about an early election. And then on the Tuesday after the bank holiday Monday, Downing Street announced she was making a statement outside number 10. And she called the election. And she triggered the most extraordinary campaign. I think it was more extraordinary than the 79 election, even if that outcome became historic for what followed with the Thatcher governments. The campaign was extraordinary for lots of reasons. One was this. For understandable reasons, Linton Crosby, her election strategist, told her that the campaign should be about her. She was the asset for the Conservatives. And so posters were plastered around the country which emphasised Theresa May. Crosby also said one other thing, and Theresa May listened because she wasn't used to fighting elections. She had kept a low profile in the referendum campaign. In previous elections, leaders above her were dominant. She was going to have to carry this one. And Crosby said, play it safe. They see you as strong and stable, so just repeat that mantra. Corbyn is doomed, and we can win big by playing safe. And she kind of bought that. But at the same time, her close and influential advisors, Nick Timothy in particular, were writing a manifesto for her to present of radical magnitude. It was arguably the most radical Tory manifesto since 1979, which was actually quite a cautious manifesto in some respects. The manifesto is an extraordinary document. It's largely overlooked now and just dismissed as a disaster because of what followed. But it was quite a bold refutation of Thatcherism. There was a big section in there arguing about the good that government can do. It challenged the idea that markets were always right and famously had a specific policy to back that up. They were going to intervene in the energy market. And more famously, it dared to put forward a proposal to pay for elderly care with calamitous consequences because Tory voters, elderly Tory voters, felt they were going to be victims if they fell to what became known very quickly, within seconds, as the dementia tax. But the mistake she made and others made was not necessarily the manifesto, certainly elements of it. The Conservative Party, if they were to be genuinely modernising, had to think again about their attitudes towards the role of government, public spending and the rest. And indeed, Conservative MPs from across the party came back from the election saying, our voters have had enough on austerity, they want more to be spent on schools and all the rest of it, and hospitals. So they had to look again. And any leader who replaces Theresa May will be in the same position as her in looking again at these issues. But when you are changing a party's approach to things as fundamental as government and the state, you as a leader have to become a teacher. For many years before the 79 election, Margaret Thatcher was teaching about her approach to the state. She didn't like it. And her approach towards economics. She pointed out that her father, when he ran his shop, never spent more than he earned, as a way of trying to explain monetarism. But at least she was constantly clearing the ground and preparing for change. Theresa May made no such attempt. She had spoken on the steps of Number 10 when she first became Prime Minister, in a well-received statement in which she made some of these points that were in the manifesto. But you have to be constantly out there preparing the ground. You can't just do it in the middle of an election campaign. And worse than that, she didn't, even during the election campaign, address these issues. She paraded the manifesto at the manifesto launch, after which all hell broke loose over particularly her plans for social care. But she stuck in a way that was almost like a Monty Python sketch, just by saying, I am standing for strong and stable leadership. She was parading a whole series of radical changes, but this banality was all she appeared to feel compelled to say. I think she now agrees this was a terrible mistake. She has said publicly since that they appeared to be the party of the status quo when people ached for change. Well, the manifesto was full of change, whether you agreed with it or not, but she didn't speak to it. And so one of the many assumptions of the 2017 election that were turned on the head was that in the end the campaign doesn't make that much difference. Clearly it did in a negative way for Theresa May, and the negativity in terms of not speaking to a radical manifesto was reinforced by another thing. She was fighting a presidential contest while being uncomfortable at projecting herself. This is highly unusual in British politics. Most prime ministers are partly actors and they love the stage and they are fascinated by the way they project themselves on the stage. Margaret Thatcher was partly an actress. She wasn't as self-confidently assertive in private as she appeared in public, nervous even about calling general elections when she was about 30 points ahead in the opinion polls. Tony Blair was an actor at Oxford University and was always fascinated by his role on the political stage, how he was seen. David Cameron almost copied Tony Blair as a projector and fascinated too by the choreography of politics. Theresa May was not. She is and was shy, publicly awkward, and yet was seeking to fight the most presidential election in modern times. Even Cameron, a good performer, allowed others onto the political stage. In her case, even her chancellor didn't get a look in during the campaign. It was about her, but she was this shy, self-effacing figure. So the campaign was jarring. It didn't explain why it was proposing big leaps for a party that had been, in many ways, still Thatcherite in its approach to economic policy making, and why it appeared to be targeting its own natural voters, elderly voters, who always turn out to vote. It was one of many twists. The other twist was this. One of the other assumptions which triggered her decision to call an election was a Labour leader, a millimetre to the left of someone like Tony Blair, would lead his party to doom. This was the assumption of many commentators, and they had some evidence for forming that view. Before the general election, the Conservatives gained a seat from Labour in Cumbria. Governing parties rarely gain by-elections, but Labour lost this seat. The local election results, which took place in the early part of the general election campaign, were really bad for Labour. And it is a testament, whether you agree with his politics or not, to Corbyn's resolve that he didn't let those factors get him down. I think any leader would be fleetingly depressed by by-elections going wrong and local elections going wrong, with a general election looming. Corbyn, John McDonnell and others who have been campaigning throughout their lives, who know what it's like to be on the margins of politics, kept going. And the opinion polls suggest, again, challenging all assumptions, that the publication of Labour's manifesto and the policies included within it helped them in the same way that the policies in Theresa May's manifesto, because they were unexplained, hindered the Conservatives. Certainly the poll rating narrowed from the bizarre leaking of Labour's manifesto several days before the official publication onwards. The pledge to abolish tuition fees for students altogether, the pledge for the state to intervene in housing much more actively, amongst many other so-called statist policies, seemed to capture the admiration of voters who tended in the past not to vote, younger voters in particular. And the polls started to narrow. Corbyn also defied expectations as a campaigner. And again, it shows the degree to which commentators, so-called moderate Labour MPs, view politics through very narrow prisms. Corbyn, always been a campaigner, probably from about the age of 2. And this is a natural place for him to be. And he appeared much more relaxed than Theresa May, even though he was under intense pressure, as many expected him to be slaughtered. This word in British politics, authenticity, has become a cliche, and it's one I've never really fully believed in, really. I mean, any public performance is contrived. It's not wholly authentic. But there is no doubt in the presidential culture that we have these days, although it remains emphatically a party-based system in the end, an appearance of authenticity, if you accept the qualification, I think now is essential in leadership. It's not a bonus if you have it. If you don't have it, you are exposed in elections to a level of scrutiny that just becomes cruel. And Corbyn appeared relaxed in live debates, quite good-humoured, and in a way, again, which defies all orthodoxies, when some Tory-supporting newspapers attacked him as a friend of the terrorists and all the rest of it. He would then appear on programmes like The One Show, distributing his homemade jam from his allotment, and there was such a jarring between the attempted caricature and what was seen on screen that I think for the first time in an election, newspapers had less impact. Well, obviously they did, because the Labour vote went up rather than down. By the way, newspapers had an impact in the Brexit referendum, so they're not dead as a political force, but in this election, assumptions were overturned again, and they did not undermine Corbyn in a way that might have been expected. And so, as the result moved into focus on the day, there were still many Labour people around the country contemplating a catastrophe. I got phone calls from those working with Labour MPs in the north of England predicting a wipeout of the Labour vote. Conservatives, even during the day, dared to be pretty hopeful, to the extent that when that exit poll was broadcast on the BBC, didn't believe it. they thought fleetingly, or hoped, it was wrong. It turned out to be absolutely right. And as a result, the election transformed everything, even though Theresa May and virtually the same cabinet are still in power. Theresa May becomes a prime minister who lost a majority, but attempts to rule nonetheless. That's a big difference with February 1974, when Ted Heath called that early election. He left number 10. He tried to stay on, negotiating a coalition with Jeremy Thorpe, but he failed to do so and left. And therefore, although Harold Wilson, who took over, was a prime minister in a minority government, having to do deals with other parties like Theresa May, he was seen almost as a winner because he had won more seats and had unexpectedly done better than most assumed. Theresa May now governs as someone seen to be a loser, even though it is worth pointing out, and she does sometimes, that the Conservative vote was around about the levels Margaret Thatcher was getting in her landslide victories in the 1980s. Just shows how perceptions are determined inevitably by the precise outcome of an election, not the number of votes secured. Her authority, that was so dominant before calling the early election that I think in some ways she had become the most powerful prime minister since Margaret Thatcher in the mid to late 1980s, had all but gone. Some cabinet ministers speculated that she would be forced to resign before the summer was out. And of course, famously, the former Chancellor George Osborne, from his perch at the Evening Standard, described her as a dead woman walking. She has carried on, but it has been very, very tough. She negotiates Brexit now, framing her argument with some of her EU leaders in an entirely different light, saying, look, if you don't concede this to me, I might be forced out of power. It's actually quite a strong negotiating position, but it's not the one she assumed she would be playing. She assumed she would be playing the hand, look, I've won this election. I've got a big majority now. I'm in a strong position. You've got to listen to me. She now has to frame it in the context of weakness and working on the assumption that EU leaders would prefer her than an alternative. It means that her hope, expressed several times when she became Prime Minister first, that her leadership would be more than Brexit, is dashed. When she arrived in power with Nick Timothy and others in number 10, she had contemplated very big changes in the way Britain was governed. It's unlikely that most of those will get a majority in the House of Commons. And the Queen's speech after the general election was threadbare. The question that Theresa May and others in her government have to ask when they contemplate any proposition which involves legislation is this: will it get through the House of Commons? They don't say, is this the right thing to do? Will it get through the House of Commons? Very tough with budgets, but also other propositions as well. And all the assumptions that she made about Brexit, trying to get a mandate for her form of Brexit through the general election, of course, those two have been turned on their head. At least before the election, she was trying to navigate Brexit in a parliament where she had an overall majority, a very small one, but she had one. Now she navigates Brexit with no overall majority. It's tough, tough, tough. For Jeremy Corbyn, the reverse is the case, even though it is worth stating he lost. He's not Prime Minister. It was a victory of sorts. Those in his party who are critical of him, and there are still many, some of them have said, look, you know, he should have done much better in this election. The Tory campaign was so useless, Labour should have won easily. That is unfair revisionism on the part of Corbyn's critics. There is no tougher election for a leader of the opposition to fight than one called suddenly and unexpectedly by a Prime Minister 25 points ahead in the polls, and with a lot of your party mouthing public criticisms of you. And yet, in that context, Corbyn put on a substantial increase in Labour's vote and wiped out Theresa May's majority. People joked that the Labour Party conference that followed in Brighton a few months later was like a victory conference, even though they were still in opposition. And there is no doubt that it is almost beyond compare, the mood at Labour's pre-election conference in Liverpool. They didn't know it was going to be a pre-election conference, but it was, which was gloomy and had just taken place in the context of another leadership contest result, and the Brighton revivalist mood after the election. It felt like two different political parties. And all the constant speculation that Corbyn was about to be removed has gone, at least for now. He is in the strongest position he's been in as Labour leader. But I think more than any of this, the 2017 election has made everybody think about their assumptions in British politics, whether they really know what's going on in the country. Brexit was an early sign when most commentators assumed that Britain would vote for the status quo because Britain in the end is a small c conservative country and votes for the status quo. It didn't happen. And by the way, equally so in a way in 2010, in the general election, when many people thought the Conservatives would win a big overall majority, but instead, weirdly for the UK, it elected a hung parliament and we had a peacetime coalition. Another sign that Britain was becoming more turbulent and risk-taking in what it did in general elections. And the 2017 election, in retrospect, commentators, MPs, perhaps Theresa May, should have seen it coming. Younger people feeling restive and poorly served by governments as they seek housing and fear big debts if they go to university and all the rest of it. The turbulence of the Scottish referendum reflected again perhaps across the country in people protesting in different ways. The 2017 election, although in many ways standing out as wholly distinctive and freakish, as I say, turning all assumptions on their head, is actually part of a wider pattern. Since the financial crash of 2008, virtually every election or referendum held in the United Kingdom has been a nerve-shredding experience for all those who took part. And the consequences of the 2017 election will be played out for many years to come. The outcome of Brexit will unquestionably be shaped by it. Theresa May's fate as a Prime Minister will be determined by it. Most think she won't fight another election. Jeremy Corbyn becomes stronger, but can he hang on for 5 years if that's how long it takes? Many questions raised by a seismic general election.